That's right. Bear down, Bears fans. It's time for another edition of the Chicago Bears podcast, Bears Banter, powered by Second City Gridiron. Bill Zimmerman with you, and the Bears regular season, thank goodness, is in the rear view mirror. It's tough as an NFL fan because the regular season ending is a bummer, but when you're covering the Chicago Bears, you want to just fast forward to the finish line as quickly as possible when you're in the midst of these things. But man, oh man, we are here. We are in a coaching search. We have a lot to get to on today's podcast, including a guest, Dan Wiederer of the Chicago Tribune. He is going to be by here. We're going to be talking about everything that's been happening at Halas Hall this week. It's been a busy week at Halas Hall. So here's the traffic for the show today. What we're going to do, I'm going to talk a little bit about Packers, a little bit about Ryan Poles, a little bit about those press conferences earlier this week. Coaching search, I'm going to hang off on that until the mailbag at the end of the segment. Tons of mailbag questions, 99% of them on the coaching search. So we're going to talk coaching search during the mailbag segment because it just makes sense there. Otherwise, I'm going to be repeating a lot of things on a podcast, which there's no reason to repeat anything because it's not a live show. So let's dive into it. Let's talk a little bit about the Packers game. And here's what I will say about that. Great win. I'm happy the losing streak is over. I'm thrilled that Caleb Williams is 1-0 at Lambeau Field. I'm not like over the moon backflips because overall the game didn't matter that much. You know, Green Bay was going to be in the same spot basically either way. Jordan Love didn't play for most of the game. So like, look, I'm not going to sit here and pretend that this was defeating the Aaron Rodgers Packers in week 18 to keep them out of the playoffs. We should all be celebrating kind of a thing, but we should absolutely be happy. Thrilled that happened. I'm glad Thomas Brown got a win. You know, he didn't need to end his tenure winless. That was all positive there. And you beat the Green Bay Packers, which of course is a positive. I have said many times on this podcast, I'm never one to cheer against the Bears in the moment, but I am all for tanking. And especially tanking needs to happen when you need a quarterback, especially if there are quarterback prospects to be had at the top of the draft. Tanking for a draft where Kenny Pickett is the top quarterback taken like 18th overall or whatever that was, not necessary for those years. There's not a reason to tank for me to drop from like the 8th spot to the 5th spot. I don't see a lot of benefit there. So I know some Bears fans wanted to lose to the Packers to help with draft positioning. I just wasn't one of those guys, especially when I looked at this thing. I don't know if you guys followed, but at Bill T. Zimmerman on Twitter, I simmed the season when it was clear the Bears were toast, probably mid-November, and I had them with the 11th pick. I just said, if this team wins one game, they're not going to get much better than the 9th or 10th pick. That's just how this season is going to, how it's going to work out. And sure enough, yeah, they end up with the 10th pick of the draft, which is fine. There's going to be very good prospects there at that point. Outstanding, excellent, end of story. Glad we beat the Packers. Now, let's move on to the decision to retain Ryan Poles, which is a weird one. Not so much that they decided to retain him. And as I have said on this podcast the last few weeks, I didn't think Ryan Poles' footing at Halas Hall was as sturdy as people made it out to be. Now, when we get to these press conferences, which we're going to talk about, it seems that that's accurate. And we'll get into wording about what Kevin Warren said to do that a little bit further. So I feel comfortable in what I've been saying about Ryan Poles. And as I had stressed saying that about Ryan Poles, I was not ever saying they're going to fire Ryan Poles. I just thought it was more on the table than some people just saying he's staying, he's getting extended, this is all a shoo-in. It's just not the vibe I was getting from talking to people. So here we are with Ryan Poles. Now, I will say this. I am not a guy that just wants to sit there and fire everybody and rip things up and start over all the time. But I do think when you assess Ryan Poles, you have to get to a point where you sit here and say there's a lot more bad than there is good. Now, when you look at the process, a lot of the process he's done in terms of clearing cap space and acquiring draft capital and those type of things, a lot of the process I think is overall pretty sound. But it's what you do with that process that's more problematic. And the Ryan Poles assessments are really starting to pile up in terms of the questionable category. Like, how many players this year, when you look at this Bears team, how many players do you think outperform just your own personal belief as a Bears fan? Forget what, Dan Orlovsky thinks on ESPN. You as a Bears fan, you had certain expectations for players. How many of those players met or exceeded those expectations this year? It can't be many. Maybe you didn't have that high of expectations for Caleb Williams. You're okay where he was. He had a solid rookie season. I'm not complaining about it, but I do think he was a bit below expectations. I think all the wide receivers were below expectations. Cole Kmet was below expectations. Everyone across that offensive line was below expectations. You could argue Darnell Wright met expectations, but I expected a bigger jump from Darnell Wright. So you're talking about potentially, and the running backs did not meet expectations. Actually, DeAndre Swift met my expectations, but that's why I didn't think DeAndre Swift should have been signed in the first place. So when I look at the offense as an entire unit, nobody lived up to expectations. When I look defensively, Edmonds and Edwards, again, slipped at the end of the year. The entire defensive line, other than Andrew Billings, who only played 7.5 games, below expectations, except for Gervon Dexter. Gervon Dexter exceeded my expectations, probably met a lot of your expectations. So we're talking about one player who was healthy for the season in Dexter and Billings. That's it across the defensive line. DeMarcus Walker probably met my expectations. I think Walker had a solid season. The linebackers did not. The secondary, Stevenson didn't. Gordon maybe met, but I was expecting more from Gordon, growth in coverage this year. He's phenomenal at making plays. Need a little more from Gordon in coverage. Didn't see as much growth as I'd hoped. Byard met or exceeded expectations. So basically, Jalen Johnson, not great season, not as good as he was the year before. So when we look at this team, we're talking about a handful of guys, 3-4 guys total that met or exceeded expectations. Everyone else fell below expectations. The team was supposed to have a breakout season and went 5-12. When you can't just blame coaching on everything. And even if you want to try and blame coaching on a lot of this stuff, well, again, Matt Eberflus was Ryan Poles' hire. And while we can sit here and talk about that he had a short list to pick from and he picked Matt Eberflus, and I do agree that was the situation. So bringing Matt Eberflus in originally is a lot of Bill Polian and not as much Ryan Poles. But I do believe that Ryan Poles was in Matt Eberflus's corner in 2023 and starting the 2024 offseason. I firmly believe that. So that becomes part of Ryan Poles' assessment, in my opinion. And then just the overall construction of the roster and the allocation of resources. Paying a running back. DeAndre Swift had a higher cap hit this year than Saquon Barkley. Paying a running back and paying that running back when you let David Montgomery walk, when you didn't make a huge push for Saquon Barkley, you may not have been able to get him anyway. But again, allocation of resources. Paying 2 linebackers when you had Jack Sanborn already on the roster. Allocation of resources. Not going after major offensive line free agents except for Nate Davis, which was a complete bust, and you didn't listen to Luke Steckel, who told you not to sign him after coaching him for 4 years. Again, questionable assessments from Ryan Poles. When you look at the draft, how has he done on day 3 of the draft? He took a punter that had a pretty good rookie season as a 4th-round pick. He needed to do that even better. Torrey Taylor has to have a much better season to justify spending a 4th-round pick on a punter, especially when there are other holes on that offensive line. What has he found on day 3 other than Braxton Jones? Braxton Jones is a great find on day 3, and we talked about it after his first year. Wow, Braxton Jones, what a find on day 3. But now we're 3 drafts in, and we're still wondering who else he's found on day 3. His third-round picks are really, really awful. Karan Amagaji should not have played this year, but he did. Awful. When you look at the other third-round picks, Zach Pickens is awful. He does not do well. Velus Jones, his third-round picks are not good. Those are day 2 picks. You have to hit something there. He's hit nothing. His second-round picks are pretty good. But again, and first-round picks, he hasn't had that many opportunities here yet because you can't assess Caleb and Rome at this point. Darnell Wright looks good. Darnell Wright isn't like wildly exceeding expectations, but certainly no one's complaining about Darnell Wright's productivity. The complaint there is, should they have tried to go for the blue chipper in Jalen Carter? We're not going to do that right now. We're not going to play ifs and buts right now. We're going to look at what Ryan Poles has done, and what he has done is a resume that does not show any reason to extend him as a general manager. And for me, and as I've discussed on this podcast, if you cannot justify extending Ryan Poles at this point, you needed to fire him and needed to start fresh and bring in a head coach and a GM that are aligned, who are both fully in the Caleb Williams camp. So in essence, you've aligned all 3, and Caleb's good enough to overcome losing that coach in year 1. We hope, we believe, we expect. So that's what we're looking at here. Ryan Poles should not be extended, so that means he needs to be fired, unless you're the Chicago Bears. And let's get to the press conferences here, and we'll start with Kevin Warren, and then we'll talk a little bit about how Ryan Poles was, and we'll finish with George McCaskey before we get to Dan Wiederer. Kevin Warren, who is supposed to be overseeing football operations and making these decisions about what to do with Ryan Poles and Matt Eberflus. He's supposed to be the one to sign off on that. So when the media comes to Kevin Warren and says, Ryan Poles' contract, is he going to get extended? Are you going to align him with the coach, in essence? Kevin Warren's response that a year is a lifetime is insane. Now, he did say another thing about where you're making a lot of assumptions there, which may have been a hint that Ryan Poles has 2 years remaining on his contract. We all expect that it's 1 year. We've heard some different reporting there. I don't know what the answer is there, but I honestly don't care if it's 1 year or 2 years left. I'm still in the same camp that Ryan Poles either needs to be extended with this new coach or terminated and a new GM brought in. If your plan is to bring in a head coach this year, then assess Ryan Poles next year and possibly terminate Ryan Poles next year, then this Bears organization is just as backwards as they've ever been. And I have been on this podcast hopeful that Kevin Warren is going to have them running in a more professional direction. And I think he has done that in a lot of ways. But if this is what they're doing with football operations, then the Bears are still backwards, because there is what do we want to do? We want to align the president, then the president with the general manager with the head coach with the quarterback. It's like a trickle-down thing, and everything's aligned. And therefore, the president is good with the GM that he's brought in. The GM is good with the coach that he's brought in. The coach is good with the quarterback that he's going to coach. Everything's aligned. That's the idea. The Chicago Bears very well might go quarterback in 2024, head coach in 2025, general manager in 2026. You could not do it more backwards. Chicago Bears, please learn from your mistakes, but you insist on assuming you're doing it right when you've had, two playoff appearances and 1 winning record under George McCaskey, and nothing changes. And Kevin Warren's comment, the 1 year is a lifetime, is the worst damn thing I have heard out of a mouth that's not George McCaskey in a while, when I want to see the Chicago Bears team finally get moving in the right direction. If they get moving in the right direction, it is going to be thanks to generational luck and nothing to do with them actually fixing anything at Halas Hall. The Caleb Williams trade was generational luck. Congratulations, Ryan Poles. That trade is probably what's saving your job. But David Tepper, an organization with potentially more dysfunction than the Bears, screwed that whole thing up, forced the trade, potentially took the wrong quarterback, at least took the wrong quarterback for the rookie season that put the Panthers back in the number one spot for Caleb Williams to go to the Bears. Now, if Ben Johnson, and we'll get into this more in the final segment, comes to the Bears, it is highly likely that that happened because Trent Baalke was not dismissed by Shad Khan, and Ben Johnson doesn't want to be anywhere near Trent Baalke. I will talk about the Jaguars more in the final segment of the podcast, but people keep comparing Trent Baalke to Ryan Poles. It's not comparable. We'll get into why in the final segment of the podcast. That may get Ben Johnson to Chicago by default because the Patriots go with Vrabel. Ben Johnson really needs to take a job this cycle. He can't keep turning down all these jobs. It's going to start hurting him eventually, and he may have no choice but to come to the Bears. Generational luck if Caleb and Ben Johnson save this franchise. Nothing that they did, that they fixed in their organization had anything to do with this process. This is just them falling ass over tea kettle and falling into possibly a phenomenal quarterback and phenomenal coaching prospect. And again, is Ben Johnson coming here if the Bears have J.J. McCarthy? If that pick wasn't the number one pick, it's the number 6 pick, 8 pick? No, he's not coming here. He's coming here for Caleb Williams. So it's David Tepper, again, putting all this in alignment for the Bears, despite them falling all over themselves. And George McCaskey will finish with that. Well, actually, Ryan Poles looked awful again at the podium. Ryan Poles, hey, when he wants to say, be like, hey, we got Caleb, we got Roma Dunze, everything's awesome. Yeah, okay, he can be loose and have fun at the press conference. But if he doesn't have that, then he is nervous, uncomfortable, and he does not show leadership. Maybe Ryan Poles wants a leader of men because he knows he's not one. I don't know, but he looked miserable up there. Again, body language was awful. George McCaskey, if you want to bitch and moan that Bears fans sold their tickets to the Lions fans, then you better own up to the fact that you sold suites to Lions fans. People you knew were Lions fans. So don't give the BS that that's bothered you and that you were okay with sell the team because the fans should be upset, but you were upset that they sold their tickets to Lions fans. They don't want to see your crappy product, George. That's your problem. Now, finally, and this is the comment that pissed me off the most before we get to Dan Wiederer. George McCaskey saying he doesn't think GM alignment and coach is important, which was stupid and idiotic. But then his reasoning was even worse. His reasoning that, well, in any interview I've ever participated in, it didn't matter. It never came up. The coach didn't ask. Okay, George, let's examine that, shall we? You came in 2010, whatever it was, 2011. You fired Jerry Angelo. You brought in Phil Emery. Phil Emery, 1 year in, fires Lovie Smith, brings in Mark Trestman. He had multiple years left, 3 years left on his deal. So there was no worry from Mark Trestman about GM alignment because it was there. Then you fire both of them after 2014. You bring in John Fox and Ryan Pace together. There's alignment. It didn't matter again. Let's jump ahead to 2022 when you brought in Matt Eberflus and Ryan Poles together. Alignment, default, it's there. There's nothing to worry about. So what's left? What's left is when Ryan Pace hired Matt Nagy. And what happened then? On January 1st, 2018, Ryan Pace got an extension. And a week later, he hired Matt Nagy as his head coach. There was alignment. So, George, the only reason a coach has never asked about alignment is because there's always been some level of alignment with the GM and the head coach. Now there isn't. Why does this team have such boobery at the top of the franchise? I cannot. Every year When that guy opens his mouth on the Tuesday after the season, I want to rip what's left of my hair out of my head. I cannot deal with him. It's not good for my health, my blood pressure. Save me, George. Do something intelligent. I thought you just stop opening your mouth. Please realize that you should not be the chairman of this franchise. It is so frustrating because, like Josh Norris, he puts out the sign, the picture with the sign, bad teams stay bad because of ownership. And it is so damn true with this Chicago Bears franchise. It's so frustrating to know that in the end of the day, George McCaskey is at the top of the pyramid, and he is it. Even if Kevin Warren has a lot more say, George is still the one who's got to sign off on everything, and he's the one ultimately making these final decisions. And he just is not capable. He does not have the capacity to do it. Dan Wiederer joins me next. This is Bill Zimmerman, Bears Banter. We'll be right back. Welcome back into the podcast. Excited to talk to this guy. He came on last spring, right around the draft, did a great job. Excited to have him on another time. He is Dan Wiederer of the Chicago Tribune and, of course, of the Take Back the North podcast, which the Bears have not done yet under Ryan Poles. And he joins me now. Dan, Bill Zimmerman, how you doing?
I'm good, Bill. It's probably a very different tone of our conversation back in the spring. Things were a little bit different for the Chicago Bears back then, but happy to be here.
Yeah, look, things were pointing up. I think a lot of us thought this Chicago Bears season was going to be this great breakout season that a lot of people have been hoping for since 2018. Obviously didn't happen. A lot of reasons for that. We'll get into some of that here as we kind of talk about some things here over the next 20 minutes or so. But let's start on a positive note, and that positive note being the Green Bay Packers game, which I even saw some fans, they wanted them to lose for tanking purposes. And when I look at that, if there is a quarterback prospect and you have a chance to land one and you get upset at some late wins, I go back to the Curtis Enis selection after the Bears won like 3 out of their last 4, took them out of the Peyton Manning sweepstakes, like that kind of stuff. Like, I understand the frustration there, but if you're not going for a quarterback, for me, get wins for your quarterback, for your young roster, finish out on a positive note, especially against a rivalry like the Packers. I think the Josh Blackwell, that was a fun play. There was some positives to take from that game going into the offseason. What did you think of that Packers game?
Well, first and foremost, anybody that wanted them to lose that game, I would suggest carving out 8 to 9 minutes and going and watch Caleb Williams' post-game press conference and just see the emotions that he felt after the final game of his rookie season, which were so needed, right? Like, this is a quarterback who had been through hell for 3 months and had gone through the 10-game losing streak. To not have to carry the weight of that losing streak for the next 8 months is huge for a young quarterback. To be able to have that final result to marry up with the sort of the late game clutch play that he showed throughout the season was a big deal. And so I think for this football team, there was a sense of relief. There was a sense of fulfillment that the game itself forced them to be resilient to the very last second, right? And your kicker, who had a kick blocked the first time he played the Packers, had to make a 51-yarder at Lambeau Field against the wind in 7-degree temperatures. There are a lot of meaningful little moments that can come out of that. I will say this, Bill. I said early in the week that leave it to the Bears to have a win with that much feel good and fun attached to it, that in a normal situation would have carried us for 6 or 7 days of programming and everybody would have been able to revel and all the things that happened in that football game. And we had to pack it all into about 8 or 9 hours before we flip the page to the business ahead for the Bears, which is obviously all of the heavy lifting that's going to come with the coaching search.
Yeah, and we'll get to the coaching search, but before we do, I want to get to some couple of things that happened at Halas Hall this week. The first one being the decision to retain Ryan Poles. And I am not a guy that just wants to go out there and fire everybody.
Nor am I.
I don't cheer for people to lose their jobs. But at the same time, I want to look at the Ryan Poles assessment as objectively as I can. And while we do that, I want to ask you this, because obviously Matt Eberflus was fired right after Thanksgiving. Thomas Brown comes in. And in a lot of ways, I think the team actually regressed, which was hard to say based on how poorly they were playing. But the on-the-field product regressed in a lot of ways. after Thomas Brown took over, especially defensively. I think we have to admit that Matt Eberflus was a better defensive coordinator, at least calling plays, than Eric Washington. So when I look at the final 5 games of the season, I hear some people say, well, there's not much to assess there. The coach was already fired. The players packed it in, etc. To me, if I'm going to assess Ryan Poles' roster that he's put on the field, I think there's a lot of assessment in those 5 games. And I'm not sitting there saying it's going to be make or break to decide if Gervon Dexter is a great defensive tackle, a good defensive tackle, or an average defensive tackle, but how that roster responds. Is there a bounce? Do they show professional pride? Are they giving 100% for 60 minutes for the next 5 games? I think all that is important when Ryan Poles wants to talk about the culture that he's building at Halas Hall. So to me, the people who said, I don't think there's much assessment you can get out of the last 5 weeks, I disagree. I'm curious what you think.
I am in the same boat with you and rowing in the same direction, because I don't think you can just let Ryan Poles off the hook for having to fire the coach that he hired and then stood behind when he had a chance to dismiss him last offseason. And so you don't just get a free pass because that guy's out the door. Like you said, there was some roster testing to be done in those last 5 weeks, some character testing to be done. Prime example, you go to Minneapolis on a Monday night in December and you decide to play a 3rd round left tackle in Karan Amagaji. And part of that is to see, do we have answers on our roster? When we go into this offseason and we have to rebuild our offensive line, do we have guys in-house that can serve as options in some of these meaningful positions? It did not go well that night for Karan Amagaji, as you remember, starting immediately with the strip sack of Caleb Williams that set the tone for that night. And obviously it continued as Caleb continued to take a beating. That's a small snapshot of the things that you are trying to look at down the final month of a lost season. Look, like, you can't stand up at the lectern for 3 years and talk about the makeup of your roster and the character in the locker room and then dismiss 15 and 36. You can't do it. Like, that's what you've put on the field for 3 years, is a product where your team has lost 70% of the football games it plays. That's part of the evaluation. When you talk about Ryan Poles' evaluation, Bill, I had someone say to me a week and a half or 2 weeks ago that some of you guys in the media are always thirsting for change. And I pushed back. I said, no, nobody's thirsting for change. People are thirsting for competence. That's what people are thirsting for. They're thirsting for results. And you can't just keep giving free passes to people who don't provide results and just hope that it magically gets better because they're going to learn from all the failures they've had, which seems to be the formula at Halas Hall. And so through that lens, I've encouraged people, go through it yourself, do the grading scale, go through Ryan Poles' day 1 draft picks, give it a grade. Day 2 draft picks, give it a grade. Day 3 draft picks, give it a grade. Extensions, trades, coaching moves, the results. We have to talk about the overall record, the division record, the road record, the record against playoff teams. Go ahead, grade it all. See what results that you see on your report card, and then feel free to announce them to the world.
All right, now let me ask you this. This is a bit of a hypothetical and not quite relevant because, like you said, Ryan Poles did stand behind Matt Eberflus after this past off season. But let me ask you this. If Ryan Poles had gone to Kevin Warren and George McCaskey after the 2023 season and said, look, we got the number 1 pick. We're going to most likely be taking Caleb Williams. I think we need to make a change at coach because I think we need an offensive-minded guy here to develop this quarterback. If that was his assessment, do you think George McCaskey would have signed off on firing a coach with 3 years left on his contract that was, went from 3 wins to 7 wins? The defense was pointed in the right direction, and the GM is admitting to ownership that it wasn't the right quarterback. Do you think that would have been on the table for Ryan Poles?
I can't say for sure as it relates to George McCaskey's input on this. I can tell you that one of the reasons you hired Kevin Warren to be the president with oversight of football operations is so that he could provide input on these types of things. And he was supposed to be provided power that if those decisions were needed, that he would be able to have the authority to help them occur. So we may never have a concrete answer on how all 3 of those men saw things at the end of the 2023 season and what direction they would have gone down had they each been given their choice exclusively. I do know that Ryan has been allowed to have freedom to make decisions that he feels are best for the team. And he has given oversight and he has given input and he's given guidance. And then ultimately he makes those decisions. As it relates to George McCaskey, people that have worked inside that building will readily tell you that George has a really big heart. And George also has a bit of stubbornness to him. And that can be a dangerous combination because you are sort of in his position, and his stance is wanting to give everyone every opportunity they possibly can have to succeed. But sometimes they fail over and over and over again. And the Bears get lost in this cycle because George can't see what's happening in front of him. He just feels with his heart that so-and-so is a good person who works hard and has the right intentions and deserves every opportunity to try to get this thing right.
All right. Let me ask you a little bit more about the assessment of Ryan Poles, because if you haven't read, those listening here, if you haven't read Dan's piece on Ryan Poles, they wrote probably about 3 weeks ago or so in the Chicago Tribune. I highly recommend you do it. It's well sourced, and it really, I think, gives a fair but critical view of what Ryan Poles has done in his tenure here. The one way I've been looking at this recently is who you've let out the door and who you've brought in the door. And there are some, and yes, they might be a year apart, but there are some that are, it's not exactly apples to apples, but it's pretty close. For example, you let David Montgomery walk. A year later, you pay DeAndre Swift. You pay DeAndre Swift more than David Montgomery originally got from Detroit. You actually pay DeAndre Swift a higher cap hit than the Eagles paid Saquon Barkley this year. That is a decision Ryan Poles made. You let Roquan Smith, you trade him. I understand you got a second-round pick for him, but you then brought in Tremaine Edmonds, and you look at the comparison of the players there. You let James Daniels walk, and then you brought in Nate Davis in essence to replace him. There are, you could even say you let Khalil Mack walk and replace them with Montez Sweat. There are multiple decisions. Darnell Mooney out the door, Keenan Allen in the door for significantly more money, and potentially you could say less productivity than what Darnell Mooney did in Atlanta. There's a lot of decisions. Usually it seems when Bears players leave, they have no success elsewhere. And you sit there and go, well, that's how bad the roster was. But in this example, you have a lot of players that Ryan Poles chose not to re-sign or trade, and then eventually brought in a replacement that did not play up to the level of the previous player. How much do you look at that level of assessment as something that's going, that Ryan Poles isn't putting together the best roster on the field?
No, like we did this exercise with Ryan Pace at some point. I don't know if it was at the end of his tenure or at the point where it maybe should have been ending, where you take a look at what you inherited, and then 4 or 5 years later, you see, are we better? Are we better at every single position? Did all the moves that I make us a better football team? And you can do that in this case. Like, I know for a fact there were people inside that building that were fighting to keep David Montgomery, because not only was he a guy who, ran the ball hard, but he was one of those tone setting guys in the room that you felt you could build an identity around. Letting him go didn't bother me at the time, because you're saying to yourself, well, okay, you can find running backs in a lot of different crevices of this league. You can draft them on day 3 and get them to turn into starters. Well, then they went out and invested in DeAndre Swift. Right. And you go, okay, so and they were heavily involved in talks to try to get Saquon Barkley. And so that wasn't a philosophy thing where it was, oh, we don't pay running backs here. It was like, we're going to move on. And David, to his credit, said, I want to go somewhere where I see direction, and God bless him. He's going to play in a playoff game here soon on a bum knee, and he's enjoying quite a joyride in Detroit. Darnell Mooney, another guy, was really curious to see what would happen in his first year post-exit here. Goes and finds a pretty good offensive system with a quarterback who could get him the football, and enjoys a resurgence. And you went out and traded for Keenan Allen because you needed to kind of upgrade your receiving core. Well, did you? You had a guy in house
and paid him $10 million more than Mooney,
right? And it would have cost some money to keep Mooney, obviously, and he got a big deal last free agency. But those are the types of decisions that are there. And so, like, you've checked off a handful of those rosters. I was, as you were talking, I was turning this page in my notebook where I wrote down the multi-year deals that Ryan Poles has given out in free agency. They include Justin Jones, Al-Qadim Mohammed, Trevor Siemian, Lucas Patrick, PJ Walker, Travis Homer, DeMarcus Walker, Nate Davis, TJ Edwards, Tremaine Edmonds, Jonathan Owens, Gerald Everett, Kevin Byard, DeAndre Swift. Like, you heard those names, and that's a spotty track record with those names that I just listed to you. Those are the people that you handpicked in free agency to come in and help fill some of these holes. Now you can do the same thing with the draft, and you can see, man, like, look, no general manager is gonna bat 750. But this feels like a lot of whiffs, and you can't be swinging and missing when you got runners on base.
Yeah, no, and that's really where I got to by the end of the year, because when I looked at this, and sometimes I forget about this, how decisions are made at Halas Hall, which maybe I really need to think about.
Yeah.
But when I looked at this, I said, all right, the decision with Ryan Poles after this season with Matt Eberflus gone is going to be to terminate his contract or to extend him. There's not going to be letting him sit around for another year and then assess him after 2025, because that just wouldn't be a sensible thing to do. And I've seen some mixed reporting. Some people say Poles has 1 year left on his deal. Some people say he may have gotten a small extension and has 2 years left on his deal. I'm not sure exactly, and maybe you have a better idea what his contract status is. But to me, honestly, I don't really care if it's 1 year left or 2 years left on a deal. To me, it's still the same decision about firing him or extending him and not leaving him in a lame duck situation with a new coach, where I sit here and go, you bring in the quarterback in 2024, the head coach in 2025, and then potentially a GM in 2026, if that's what they're going to do. That would be the most possible that's the most backwards way the Bears have even ever done it. And when I hear Kevin Warren say a year is a lifetime, that a lot of red flags went up for me on that one, Dan, because I just don't understand exactly where the direction is at Halas Hall right now in terms of what they're doing with Ryan Poles moving forward.
First and foremost, do you have a drink or a gummy that can help me forget the way decisions are made at Halas Hall? Because I'll sign up. I'll get on a monthly subscription if you can help me forget how they do things there, because what you just described mirrors the whole process of drafting a quarterback in 2021, hiring a new coach and a general manager in 2022, then hiring the team president in 2023. Backwards. Everything at Halas Hall happens backwards. And you're in danger of making it happen again if you get to the end of the 2025 season and decide that, oh, yeah, you know what? You guys were right. Ryan Poles wasn't up to the task of building this roster in the right way and getting this team to have the breakthrough that was promised. And so, yeah, they're in a danger zone here, right? Like they are at the edge of the cliff with the fingernails dug in, trying to hang on and trying to make a hire here that's going to rescue everybody. Ryan Poles is very fortunate to still have his job after the results that have been put on the football field for the last 3 years. Now he's got to make one of the most high stakes decisions in franchise history, and he's got to be right with it. And as you know, you can go through the yearly list of coach hirings around this league, and you can understand that it's not a real easy task, right? Like there are a lot of swings and misses in this department as well. And you're just banking on that you're going to have one of the hits in this hiring cycle.
All right. And I also want to ask you about Ryan Poles. This is a bit of an odd question, but you're there. You're in the press conferences when Ryan Poles is up there and talking. And to me, and again, this is just my opinion, I'm not going off of anything. The Ryan Poles that I've seen at the podium at Thanksgiving and at the end of the season is not the same Ryan Poles that I saw during draft season and over the last few months prior to that. And maybe it was just that it was a loose room and Caleb Williams and Rome Odunze were here and everyone was feeling good. So everything was positive vibes. And now he's talking about firing the coach and coming off of a extraordinarily disappointing season at 5-12. I just feel like Ryan Poles is, his body language at the podium has gotten significantly worse. Like he's lacking confidence. Do you feel I'm making too much of a jump there, or are you in the room feeling something similar?
Ryan Poles has lost public credibility. Ryan Poles has lost confidence. His demeanor mirrors those things, right? Like you have made undeniable mistakes, and your football team took a massive step back in 2024 because of it. And so you don't project the same self-confidence. You don't have the same sort of juice in the room that you had when Hard Knocks was filming and everything was in slow-mo, hyper-dramatic, feel-good, theatrical lens perspective, right? Like that's all of the things that have gone on here. And so, no, there's no question that it's been a different vibe when Ryan Poles has spoken, again, as you said, on the weekend of Thanksgiving and again this week, than what he spoke even when they were in London. Now I hadn't arrived in London yet when he spoke there, but different vibes then. The Bears were 3-2 at that point and felt like they were climbing the staircase that 2024 was supposed to be all about, and then they stepped on a stair and it was a trapdoor and down they went, right? And here we are now talking about a very busy January and possibly February as this coaching search promises to drag out for two reasons. One, because there are going to be coaching candidates that coach into February, and the Bears have assembled a list that's pretty long at this point.
It is quite extensive, and I want to ask you about that. But before I do, one last thing, I want to ask you about George McCaskey. And I know a lot of people making a big deal about the Detroit Lions. He was upset that all the Lions fans were there, and then we find out from the score that he actually sold a suite to Lions fans. That not a good look. But what frustrated me the most about that was him being asked about alignment with GM and head coach and saying it didn't matter, which obviously got me upset. But his reasoning was actually worse for me, Dan, where he sits there and says, well, of any interview process I've ever been a part of, it hasn't even come up. And I sit there and go, well, George, look at your history since you've been the chairman. Trestman was hired by Emery, who was only a year into that deal. So he had multiple years. You bring in Pace and Fox together. No issues there. You brought in Eberflus and Poles together. No issue there. And when Matt Nagy was hired, Ryan Pace got an extension on January 1st, and Matt Nagy was hired 8 days later. So it's never been an issue before this year. So whether he believes it or not, and I have a hard time knowing what exactly is the meaning behind all of George's words. A lot of times I sit there and get so frustrated when the reasoning behind something is so flawed that you sit there and see, and I don't know if you've seen it, the meme on the internet where it's just a sign outside of a stadium that says, teams stay bad because of ownership. And then when I hear something out of that mouth, like that out of George McCaskey's mouth, I sit there and go, Kevin Warren can be here to help, and maybe Ryan Poles can or can't get the job done. Maybe they hire the right coach, but he's still the end of the line, the top of the pyramid at the end of the day. And that I think for Bears fans has to be a little nerve-wracking.
Yeah, George has always suffered from a case of not knowing what he doesn't know, Bill, and that's been a problem. You documented the searches that he's been a part of since 2011 when he became the chairman, and they're not good. Those aren't good results that you got out of any of those searches. And so when he was asked this week, what's going to be different this time? Why did you have confidence that you're going to get a different result this time? Essentially, his answer was, one, we're very hopeful that Ryan Poles learned from his mistakes of hiring and retaining Matt Eberflus. And two, we're hopeful that Kevin Warren's guidance here, having been a part of other organizations and seen these processes through, will help. So it is a little bit of the old Halas Hall, close your eyes, cross your fingers, and hope situation here that they're going to go through here. You hope the leaders that I mentioned and Kevin and Ryan have a very shared vision of where they want to go with this thing and how they're going to get there, and we'll see. But George certainly hasn't given you any reason to believe that his guidance is going to be a plus for the search. And look, like Brad Biggs asked him the question to start his availability about the reaction to the sell the team chants during the Seahawks game. I wanted to follow up and say, listen, like that's all emotion-based reaction from a fan base. But when people make that suggestion or that request with level-headed sincerity, what's your reaction? Do you have any consideration with your family of one day selling this team to put it in better hands so that the dream of the Bears having sustained success can become a reality?
Yeah, and also, and you don't have to comment on this, and I'll just say it. George almost scolding you guys at the start, saying, why don't you take turns and stop trying to yell over each other? That was a little rough.
I will comment on that, Bill, because it was ridiculous, because we moved from a setting where everyone was set up in the big press conference room with Ryan Poles at the lectern, and we literally went out a door and 39 feet away to a side stage that was set up. The same people, the same 43 reporters that were there and 8 cameras had to reset up. And so, yeah, like you've been in these scrums, you know what they're like. When you need to get a question in, you have to speak up louder. There isn't a take turns. That's not how it works in media. And so, like, if you're not going to run a press conference where you pass around a microphone and call on people, that's how a press conference works. And so that scolding was just, to me, like, it's not a big deal. I didn't take it personally, right. But it's like another example of them not really understanding how things work. And that troubles you. It just troubles you, because you're like, okay, sure. Okay. We'll do that. We'll take turns, and we'll let, every single person here ask a question. You've got 10 minutes, like, there's a lot of questions to get to, George.
Yeah. Absolutely. So let's get to this coaching search before we wrap up. And look, there's a lot of good names on the list. There's a lot of names. You know, I'm a Ben Johnson guy. I hope he ends up in Chicago. I hope that the decision to keep Trent Baalke in Jacksonville helps Ben Johnson come to Chicago. I hope that the other owners' poor decisions help out the Bears, so the Bears can be helped from not helping themselves. So I look at that and I'm hopeful that maybe that's the outcome that comes. But obviously, there's no guarantee on that. So I see some other guys on there, like potentially a Todd Monken and some other guys that I think could be interesting in the role here. But I see a lot of defensive guys, a lot of, David Shaw hasn't coached in 2 years, and his last 4 or 5 years at Stanford weren't any good. Like there's a lot of odd names on the list as well. So I sit there and say, well, they should talk to everyone, so who cares if it's a list of 16 names right now? But my response to that is, well, then you should have talked to Bill Belichick in December when he had interest in the job. Doesn't mean you have to hire him, but you should talk to him if you're going to talk to everybody.
Right.
Or
Pete
put
Carroll.
together a list of a firm 7 or 8 names that you've already done your background on and go through that way, and don't, be honest, waste other people's times that you're not actually going to consider them. So I think either way, the list is a little flawed here, and there's plenty of names that are head scratchers for me. But like I said, in the end, I'm hoping that some of the names that I do think are names that they should be heading towards are the ones that kind of bubble up to the surface.
There's a golden rule in the NFL where change is constant and oftentimes inevitable, that you have your lists ready. If change is needed, you've got an index card in the top drawer of your desk at work that says, hey, here's the guys I would really want to replace the person that's occupying that role right now. It doesn't feel like the Bears had that list either ready or finalized when they walked into this process, because they keep adding names to this list. And you mentioned guys that to me are no chance guys. Like, you can put Drew Petzing on that list. If you ask me, you can put Matt Campbell on that list. Are you really going to take the leap of faith that a guy's going to come out of college, having never spent a day in the NFL in his life, and he's suddenly going to command this locker room, which is asking for very specific things from its next leader? Mike Kafka, local product, St. Rita graduate, went to Northwestern, has some good stuff on his resume in terms of working with Patrick Mahomes early in his career. He's coming off a season where the Giants went 3-14, and his stock is not exactly on the rise. And it's hard to imagine, again, that he's going to be able to, on day one, stand up in that room and give everyone the belief that they're in good hands. Are you really willing to make that gamble here? So if you're not, and you're just doing these interviews to get information, you're putting yourself in jeopardy of wasting some time, wasting some energy, losing some focus on what you're actually trying to do here, which is hire the next great head coach. And the one thing that I've said to a lot of people is that if you really see these as very valuable information gathering processes, don't forget that just 3 years ago, the Bears talked to 23 people for their general manager and head coach openings. And if that information was so valuable, then why are we here after 36 losses over the last 3 seasons and another search for a new head coach with people not really having a clear-cut vision of where they want to take things?
Yeah. And again, like, if you're going to cast a wide net, and like you said, why wasn't that list at a minimum started after the Hail Mary against Washington? Like, you had to have had at least a couple alarm bells go off after that one and go, maybe he's not the right guy, because that was pure coaching.
What about after the Green Bay loss to end last season, when right, a lot of the world was saying, I don't know if this head coach is cut out for it? At that point, that list should be starting to be written in Sharpie instead of pencil, and saying, if this goes haywire, which we know it could, these are the guys I want to target. Now, listen, all those lists can be evolving and expand whenever you want, because you want to expose yourself to as many viewpoints as possible. But this seems to lack a little bit of clarity to me, and it doesn't fit like with what they're saying they want, because I think you and I could listen to some of the criteria that they've laid out and easily eliminate 33% of this list and save everyone a lot of time.
Yeah. And in terms of like you said, you could eliminate names off the list, but then I look at a name like Liam Cohen, who may not be ready, right? He's young. He's just, he's coming into his own here. And you may sit there and say, well, he doesn't have enough experience, but you got Joe Brady on the list. Now, Liam Cohen, you actually brought in for an offensive coordinator interview last year. You chose Shane Waldron over him. He has become a rocket in terms of what he's done in Tampa Bay and how he's perceived, where I've heard people say that of this coaching cycle, like some people think Liam Cohen's ceiling is higher than Ben Johnson. So, and again, he could still get added to this list.
Right. I was just going to
why
say
isn't he on this list right now? Like a lot of it.
He may be, and we just don't know. But this list is huge. I mean, this list is huge right now. And you would just think, particularly with, do we have 6 openings right now after the Raiders one came open, that, and no clarity fully yet on Dallas. If you had twice as many candidates as job openings, you're going to be in good shape, right? Like, so if you just capped your list at 12, that's still a lot of people to talk to. And you would probably be able to find a appealing hire out of your list of top 12. I don't know why it gets so gray for them. And they think, candidate number 18 may suddenly have this surprise emergent and become their next head coach. That scares me a little bit, because this is an organization that can get cute at times. And this is not a time, particularly with the arrival of Caleb Williams and the dynamics of his rookie contract, to start getting cute and trying to be the smartest person in the room.
Yeah, because to me, a lot of times surprise candidates mean that they're bad candidates. There's a reason they're not on anyone else's radar. Like, it's just the way I look at things. And some of the other names like Brian Flores, I look, phenomenal job in Minnesota and a culture changer and all that. I get that, but I just don't know how you can look at what happened with Flores and Tua and even consider him for Caleb Williams. So there's plenty, but let me just ask you this before I let you go. Are you a Ben Johnson guy? Is that your number one choice? And if it is, great. And if it's not, who is that guy? Like, in essence, if Ben Johnson is off the table of this list, or maybe someone who's not on the list, who does Dan Wiederer, follows the NFL, think would be potentially really good candidates? Maybe there's a couple names that you think they should highly consider for the role.
I have no issues choosing from the headliner list that they have assembled right now. I agree with you on Flores. The quarterback growth plan doesn't seem to carry the psychological component that would be super healthy for Caleb Williams. I am a Ben Johnson guy. I've talked to enough people around the league to understand that there is no perfect candidate, but that his resume and his traits and the things that he has done in Detroit should translate into a head coaching job. You mentioned my podcast at the outset, Take the North Pod. I had Dave Burkett of the Detroit Free Press on earlier this week, and he gave an elaborate scouting report on Ben Johnson that I think people should listen to, because it will tell you what somebody that's been around Ben for 5 years has seen and witnessed and experienced in his growth in Detroit. So go all in on that. Try to make that happen. I would have no problem if Mike Vrabel became the head coach here. It really does sound like the New England Union is probably going to take that off the table before the Bears get too deep into this. But I would have no problem if he presented a clear offensive vision and convinced me that the staff he was going to put together on both sides of the ball was solid. I would have no problem going down that path as well. And I do not have issue with Pete Carroll's age. I don't. Like, Pete Carroll averaged 10 wins over 14 seasons in Seattle, and I know he's defensive minded, but you hear the comments of Geno Smith after he played at Soldier Field a couple weeks ago, and you understand that Pete has had a knack for tapping into his quarterbacks as well, and his leadership and his energy and his ability to create belief is very real. I understand the reservations. Again, there's no perfect candidate, but I would have no qualms if he was announced as the 19th head coach of the Chicago Bears in a couple weeks, because I do think that there would be an immediate change in the vibe in that building, an immediate change in the belief in that building. You're noticing I'm not using the C word. You can spell it out, Culture here, because I have made a vow that I will not use that word as it relates to the Chicago Bears until they have a 9 in the W column, until they have proven that in a given season they can win more than they lose. I don't care about your culture. Don't tell me about it.
All right, I like that. That's fair. And I am a little hesitant on Pete Carroll's age, but what I have said multiple times, I would love if Pete Carroll was in the building. A guy like that knows how to run a franchise. If he can have some sort of role in the building, I would love it. And you could absolutely sell me on him as the head coach, but 74 at the start of next season. I know he's youthful, in terms of spirit and all. To me, it's a little Todd Monken is kind of Pete Carroll on the offensive side of the ball, and he's 15 years younger. So
listen, I don't want to say it too loudly, because if I say it too loudly, they'll go in an opposite direction. But I like Todd Monken a lot. I whisper that I like Todd Monken a lot.
There he is, Dan Wiederer of the Chicago Tribune, as I choke on myself here. And of course, the Take the North podcast. Dan, thank you. That was a great interview. And we'll see what kind of develops here over the next couple of weeks. And hopefully they land a good one.
Always fun, Bill. Talk soon.
All right, there he is, Dan Wiederer, everybody. Good spot with Dan. A lot of good opinion, a lot of good information. He'll comment on anything. I'm trying to let him off the hook to not criticize George McCaskey for scolding the media on how they run press conferences. He jumps right in. You got to appreciate Dan. I know a lot of fans don't appreciate Dan when he speaks what he feels is the truth, like he did at the end of Justin Fields' tenure. But in the end, I think there's two ways to report. There's reporting on what's actually happening, and then there's reporting on what could happen. And when you report on what could happen, it's usually a way to put positive spins on things. It's like, hey, this player could get better, this player could get better, and the whole team could get better. There's doing that. There's focusing on features as to why these players are improving. You can build hope, or you can report accurately what's happening, which is, when it's the Bears, usually pretty negative. So we appreciate Dan for his time, and I thought that was a really good interview. So let's jump into the mailbag. We have a ton of questions. I'm going to rip through as many as I can. And like I said, I'm going to use this to talk about the coaching search, because just about all these are on the coaching search. So we're just going to go through it. We're going to start with Chris Armstrong. Hey, Bill, is this the usual organizational incompetence or a new incompetence as to why they retain Poles? Well, Chris, that's the thing right now is, and let's wait a couple weeks and see if Ryan Poles has an extension announced. But if they lame duck Ryan Poles, if they're really going to do this and get the alignment so backwards, as Dan and I talked about, I think it's new level. Because at least like Dan talked about doing it backwards like they did in 22-23 with the GM and coach at the same time, and then the president the year after, which I agree, totally backwards. That at least the GM and the head coach came in at the same time. I think this would be a new level of incompetence in terms of alignment at Halas Hall, and maybe they just fall into it ass backwards and actually get it right. Thanks to Caleb Williams. Like we cannot thank Caleb Williams enough for being here as Bears fans. That's the bottom line here. That's what it comes down to. All right, we've got Bill, who says, I see it this way. A majority of fans want Johnson, with smaller pockets looking at other candidates. If they hire Johnson and he falls flat, the majority will be the first to complain to why they didn't hire somebody else and who's winning elsewhere. And look, I get that fans are going to complain, because here's the deal, Bill. At the end of the day, we can want Ben Johnson as fans, but it's up to the front office to make the determination. Like, we can sit here and be like, oh, they signed this player. That's awesome. He's going to be great. And then he falls on his face. And as long as you admit, in my eyes at least, as long as you admit you thought that it was smart at the moment, and now it clearly wasn't, I think you're allowed to criticize. Because just because you were wrong doesn't mean you can't also say the front office was wrong. So if they get the coaching search wrong, you absolutely get to criticize them for getting the coaching search wrong. That, to me, that's pretty straightforward. Like Chase Claypool. You want to go back and find the podcast with Chase Claypool. Here's why I actually came on and said I was excited for the Chase Claypool acquisition. Not because of Chase Claypool, because I thought there were plenty of alarm bells going off about Chase Claypool. Pittsburgh Steelers fans celebrated that he was no longer on the roster. But I said I was excited that Ryan Poles is making some effort to support Justin Fields. Because this was his, there was nothing. He had an empty void around him in that 2022 season, trying to do everything by himself. I was glad he was trying to find some support for Justin Fields. I just also said, I wish it would have come in the draft and in free agency and not here. Now, that absolutely backfired, and Ryan Poles should absolutely be criticized for it. But like I said, my excitement was that he was trying to support Justin Fields with anything, which he hadn't done previously. So I think as long as you're honest about where you're coming from, you can absolutely criticize the front office. All right, at Happy Bulls Fan 11. How are you a happy Bulls fan? But hey, good for you. What makes New England's destination more attractive than Chicago's? I understand the ownership and strength of division argument, but surely the state of the roster and strength of AFC versus NFC cancels that out. No? Well, first of all, AFC versus NFC, I don't think plays into it that much. I don't think a coach looks at it and goes, oh, the AFC is too hard. I want to go to the NFC where it's easier. Coaches don't think that way. Coaches are going to be they're going to look at the roster, and he's going to look at the roster and say, maybe Chicago's roster is better, but Chicago's roster isn't as good as you think it is. We just talked about it at the Open, how so many players didn't develop, didn't take steps forward, and actually regressed. So I am not sitting here. Now, is it better than New England's? Yes. But I'm not sitting here saying that it's just light years different because of the fact that, like, is Jalen Polk going to develop for the Patriots? Maybe, maybe not. But, you can't be overly confident as him versus someone else. Like, they have pieces on defense, Christian Gonzalez, like they have pieces. Now, they have a long way to go, but they have a quarterback in place. And the big difference, and you mentioned it, ownership. Robert Kraft has run a championship organization. Yes, it was Belichick and Brady, but he was there. He was a part of it. He's seen it. No one sits here and says Bob Kraft is a terrible owner. George McCaskey is. That goes a long way. A long way. Ownership is what makes the Patriots' job more attractive than Chicago's. To me, that's it. And they still have a quarterback in Drake May who looks like he's going to be good. And I think Ben Johnson is going to look at that and say that he can do a lot of good things with Drake May. Again, I don't think it matters because I think Mike Vrabel is going to end up there. Still, all the signs are still pointing that way. But I do think Ben Johnson would pick the Patriots over the Bears simply because he would have confidence in their structure and their ownership long-term over Chicago's. All right, good karma hoarder. I could use some of that. If the Bears were going to overcorrect from their past mistakes with Flus, is it more likely they look for someone with prior head coaching experience or an offensive head coach? Hard to get a read based on the current interview list. And good karma, I think that's fair. There's a lot of defensive-minded culture builders. There's offensive-minded. There's previous head coaches. Yeah, the course correct, there really isn't a course correct. We keep hearing a culture builder, a leader of men. Well, that's what Matt Eberflus was supposed to be. And if you go look at past hires, Andy Reid said, Matt Nagy's a leader of men. Matt Eberflus was a leader of men. Like, we hear this. So whoever they hire, the Bears will tout as a leader of men. That's just what you look for as a head coach. Mark Trestman couldn't be less of a leader. And he wrote a book on leadership. They all think they're leaders of men. They will all tout in their interview why they are leaders of men. So I can't give you a straight answer on that. If I just gave you my opinion based on nothing but just a hunch, I would say the over course correction would be to hire a coach who's been a head coach before. Because while John Fox failed, I think the Bears are so concerned that Nagy failed and Eberflus fired and it failed and Trestman and all these coaches failed that, they don't look at the fact that John Fox failed too. They don't look at the fact that when you look at the best head coaches in the league, Mike Tomlin was a first-time head coach. John Harbaugh was a first-time head coach. Sean McVay, Matt LaFleur. The list goes on and on. Andy Reid was a retread in essence. So, it's not always the coach with no experience does best, but most of the time you are going to have more success finding the dynamic first-time head coach because usually when you find them, they end up being a head coach there for 10, 12 years. Not the case a lot of times with the retreads, but again, sometimes you can hit it with a retread, just I don't think as high. The thing with the retread is the floor is a lot higher. And we've talked about that. Go for the ceiling. Don't go for the floor. And Josh Lucas admitted they drafted Mitch Trubisky because of the floor. They thought they thought he was safe. That's not how you win. You don't win with safe. You win by being bold. And that's what Kevin Warren is supposed to be, is this bold guy that does big things. So hopefully they swing for Ben Johnson and they hit it. Giovanni Torres. Why is Ben Johnson's knowledge and familiarity of the NFC North not talked about as more of an advantage? He will know all other teams' strengths and weaknesses, while at the same time his offense could be a little different with Caleb as his QB. Well, Giovanni, let me mention that last thing. All we hear about is Ben Johnson is able to evolve his offense around his personnel. And that he sat down with Jared Goff and created an offense around Jared Goff's strengths. The system the Lions are running, yes, it's Ben Johnson's system, but in a lot of ways, it's the Goff system that he created for Jared Goff. When he comes to Chicago, I'll say it confidently, but if he comes to Chicago, if he is going to create an offense, I would think, around Caleb Williams' strengths. He will sit down with Caleb Williams. How do you want to play? And take his strengths and figure it out. That's what he does. That's what makes him such a great offensive mind. He looks at things in a different way. He's willing to evolve. So I think that's a big deal. In terms of familiarity with the North, well, then you could say the same thing about Brian Flores, and I don't want him anywhere near that. So should that come into play? Sure, that could help a little bit, but you still want to get the best guy for the job. And if the best guy for the job was in the AFC West, then let's go get that guy. But it just so happens that I think the best guy for the job happens to be in the NFC North. All right, we got Jay Haggart. Who would you like and who would you definitely not want to be the next head coach of the Chicago Bears? Well, Brian Flores is the guy that I do not want. And I do think there's some interest there at Halas Hall. It makes me concerned because I think Brian Flores would be the absolute worst guy to pair with Caleb Williams. I don't think it's a good idea. I think it's a really bad idea. So I could sit there and be like, well, I don't want David Shaw. Okay, fine. Like none of us want David Shaw. But of the actual candidates that I think are legitimate candidates on there, Brian Flores is the guy that I definitely do not want because of Caleb Williams. And I'll give you someone other than Ben Johnson, who's my number one guy. I'll tell you who's really growing on me. Todd Monken. Now, I kind of dismissed Monken because he's almost 60 years old, and I thought they should go for a more youthful guy, and I still think that's probably the best way to go. But I will say this, Monken's a good offensive mind. He's got experience as a head coach, albeit in college. He has a very extensive coaching record. He's been a coach for, 20 years, 25 years, and he's awesome. Like, I've checked out some press conferences of him. He's youthful. He commands a room. I think he really, even if he's older than Eberflus by a good 5-6 years, I think he would still really connect with the players, even though he's older. And I'll tell you what, I have asked a lot of people about these candidates to try and get an opinion on guys. Not one negative thing about Monken. Not one. People love this guy. So for me, Todd Monken may be my number 2 guy at this point. I think Liam Cohen is another guy because he's got, I've heard, a really high ceiling, a lot of belief in him. But right now, we don't even know if he's on the Bears list. So I'm just looking at who is on the Bears list. And I would say Todd Monken is a guy who's really jumped up the ladder for me in the last week or so. Charlie B., who are your preferred candidates not named Johnson or Vrabel? All right, we'll take this a step further. Monken, Cohen. I have a little concern about the inexperience, but Cohen would be on there. Pete Carroll, again, age is an issue for me. It's more of an issue for me than Dan Wiederer. And like I told Dan, I think Pete in the building, like special assistant to the president, sign me up. I would love to have him in the building in some capacity. I think that would be a big help for this Bears organization to have someone who really knows what the hell they're doing. I think that would be clutch for this team. But I would be okay with Pete Carroll. I certainly would be okay with Pete Carroll over a ton of names on that list. I mean, Kafka, Campbell, Shaw, Petzing, Kingsbury. I mean, a ton of guys. Like, yeah, I in terms of other guys, Joe Brady, kind of in the Liam Cohen camp. I think I'd have Cohen above Brady, but that's kind of my list. And Pete Carroll, I certainly would be okay with over a lot of the other guys. All right, Nolan, why Pete Carroll would be good for the Bears and why Pete Carroll wouldn't be good for the Bears. Well, the non-offensive mind doesn't bother me as much because of the fact that he was a big involvement in Russell Wilson. I would want to know who his offensive coordinator would be. It's obviously not going to be Shane Waldron. Darrell Bevel. Like, I don't know. Maybe he's got someone else in mind that he might be able to bring in. But there's questions about Pete Carroll, but again, the big thing is his age. I mean, you want a guy who's going to be here with Caleb Williams for 10 years, right? You think Pete Carroll's going to be coaching when he's 83? I don't. I think Pete Carroll would come in for 3 or 4 years. So I've had this tickle in my throat. It's like since the Wiederer interview here. It's really, really bothering me here. I'm going to hack all over the microphone soon if I'm not careful. All right. TJ Gobig. Could you see a scenario where Poles signs a bunch of backloaded contracts in order to save his job? No, because the free agent market sucks. I don't think they're going to do that. There's not enough guys to do that. I think with Kevin Warren there and whoever the coach is, they're going to understand that Ryan Poles, he's going to be limited if he tries to do something like that. I think Poles is just going to focus on beefing up the trenches on both sides of the ball, add a couple smaller pieces here or there, and they will go forward. I really don't think we're at a point where there's going to be backloaded contracts. Master Legend 23. If Ben Johnson's the coach, what position do you think he and Poles will target, prioritize round one? Could it be Ashton Genty? Look, I don't know what Ben Johnson wants to do. Certainly Genty's got Jahmyr Gibbs vibes. He didn't want DeAndre Swift in Detroit, so that's certainly an issue right there. But I would think it's going to be offensive line. Ben Johnson, a big part of that offense is everybody blocks. He's going to want to build that offensive line. He's going to want receivers who are willing to block. So DJ Moore better start blocking. It's going to be part of your job. Roma Dunze's already willing to do it. Cole Kmet's willing to do it. Sometimes these guys could do it better. That's why Ben Johnson's going to be here and help coach them up. So I do think they would focus on really improving the blocking on offense. I think that would be a big focus. Andrew, with Ryan Poles' press conference, it was extremely sad to watch. He lacks confidence given body language and response. Do you think that hinders the coaching hire, particularly someone like Ben Johnson? Will it be a bargain bin head coach? I don't think it's going to be a bargain bin head coach. I think they're going to get a good head coach. But could that turn off Ben Johnson? It absolutely could. But also Ben Johnson's going to have limited options. And I still would take Ryan Poles over Trent Baalke if I'm Ben Johnson. And I will just say this. I'm not going to get into details. And maybe it's on the internet somewhere on a Reddit thread somewhere. Trent Baalke did something, in my opinion, vile in San Francisco. Vile. And it got him the GM job. Okay? And I think there's enough around the league that believe that it's true. I've heard it from multiple people for years about Trent Baalke. This is not about who's a better GM. It's honestly about who's a better person. Who would you feel more trustworthy working with, Trent Baalke or Ryan Poles? And I think if you're Ben Johnson, you would have to have serious concerns that Trent Baalke would stab you in the back to Shad Khan if it made himself look better. And I don't believe Ryan Poles would do that. That's where this difference is between Baalke and Poles. It is not about their ability as a GM. It's about who they are as a person. All right. I still got this tickle. All right. We're going to cough here. I'm going to mute my mic. Hang on. So I don't have. All right. We should be back on. Hopefully you didn't hear me hack up a lum here. I'm going to drink some water. We are going to continue with this mailbag. All right. Casey Oman, how much say either directly or indirectly will Caleb have and who they hire? Indirectly, plenty, because there's going to be a lot about what's your plan at quarterback. How are you going to make Caleb Williams awesome? That's indirectly. That's a big part of it. Directly, I think very little. I think they may talk to Caleb a little bit before who they hire. Here's a couple names. Maybe they ask him a little input, but will Caleb have sway in terms of who they hire? No, I don't believe that's the case, but I do think they'll want to make sure they bring in someone who Caleb is comfortable with, because they need Caleb to succeed. If they're going to succeed, Caleb Williams has to be a top 10, maybe top 5 quarterback in the league. That's what has to happen here. So be like, I don't care what Caleb thinks. Brian Flores is going to come in. He's going to whip everyone into shape and yell at everyone, and that's what we need. That's not how you're going to develop a quarterback. So I do think it will play a factor. I just don't know exactly how much. Del Horn, will our new coach demand that mental penalties cease? Will our new coach expect the offense to not be predictable? Well, that's why you bring in a guy like Ben Johnson or Todd Monken, who have been play callers and hopefully do it in a much better capacity than the Bears are used to. So yeah, that's going to be part of it. Brian Flores, though, guy like that, he didn't know what the hell he's doing on offense. It's proven by what he did in Miami on offense, which was dreadful. Mental penalties, again, that's when they keep saying leader of men, that's the kind of thing they need to talk about. Ben Johnson, by the way, they will talk about how he is a stickler for details. That's a big part. Everyone really knows exactly what's going on every play and what their role is. And if you have that attention to detail, usually you end up with a far more disciplined team. Oak Lightning, why do people want Poles fired so bad? He created a good cap situation, good draft capital, rebuilt the secondary, wide receiver core, got legitimate starting OTs, good DLs, good linebackers, good kicker, punter, and our franchise QB. Is it all Flus? Well, Flus is part of it, and we've talked about it here. Like, I'll go through it. Did he create a good cap situation? Yes, he did, but he's also spent some of that money on Nate Davis. Wasn't a crippling contract. He also spent a ton of money on Tremaine Edmonds. That's not a good idea. Like, he's done some things here that are questionable here. Rebuilt the secondary. He wanted to trade Jalen Johnson, Oak Lightning. If he could have gotten a late first, Jalen Johnson wouldn't be here. Tyreek Stevenson isn't good. Jaquan Brisker, it's no fault of his, but he can't stay on the field right now. So there's enough questions there. And again, he utilized second-round picks to rebuild that secondary. He better have rebuilt that secondary using second-round picks. Like, that's the thing. It's not He didn't do it sneakily with fourth and fifth round guys. Look at that Tarheeb Steele that Jim Harbaugh and Tom Telesco got when the fifth round? He's awesome as a rookie in LA as a cornerback. So, like, those are the type of guys, Oak Lightning. Who has he found on day 3 not named Braxton Jones? You need someone else at this point. And Torrey Taylor doesn't count. That's a punter. And again, he spent a 4th round pick on a punter. The kicker, that's Cairo Santos. That's Ryan Pace. He doesn't get credit for that. And the franchise QB was generational luck. He gets credit for the trade. I'm not saying he doesn't, but if the Panthers went 5-12 instead of 3-14, that's it. 2 more wins. That's all we're talking about. If they went 5-12, the Bears would not have picked in the top 3. They would not have had Drake May, Jaden Daniels, or Caleb Williams. So I ask you this, Oak Lightning. When you give him all the credit for finding the franchise QB, all of us knew Caleb Williams should have been the number 1 pick in the draft. He doesn't get credit for some amazing assessment. But if we were here with J.J. McCarthy or Michael Penix or Bo Nix, I don't think Ben Johnson's even considering this job. So you have to look at how lucky Poles was as well, that he got the Panthers and they were so bad last year. So that's a big part of it. There's plenty of warts on this roster. The assessment of the players, Oak Lightning, has been bad. And that's why I'm down, and that's why a lot of people are down on Ryan Poles. Jesse Rust, if we do get Ben Johnson, do you think there's any chance we draft Genty to mirror with Detroit with 2 running backs? Again, it's early. I don't know. I think it's always possible, but I still think Ben Johnson will understand that the offensive line is where the Bears have the biggest problems. You can bring in Ashton Genty and give him 250 carries, slamming into an offensive line that can't open up holes. That doesn't get you too far. Billy Kidd, given the dysfunction of the Bears since almost forever, they seem to be going down the same road again, because they are. As evidenced by their news conference, how much faith do you have that they will get the coaches right and become a sustained winning team? Number 0 to 100%. 50-50. Again, if Ben Johnson wants to come here, kudos, congratulations. We should all feel lucky, but I am worried about Brian Flores. I'd be worried about Anthony Weaver. I'd be worried about a lot of guys on this list. Like I said, I like Todd Monken. There's names I like, but there's a lot of names I don't. And maybe, let's see who comes in for those second interviews here in a week or so. That's going to determine a lot about how much confidence I have. So right now, I'll just give you 50-50. Carl Grace, if Ben Johnson and Mike Vrabel are off the table, what surprise coaching candidate would you think gets the job? I don't want a surprise coaching candidate. I think that's code for bad candidate. If Pete Carroll counts as a surprise candidate because no one was talking about him a month ago, Pete Carroll. I don't want anyone else. Clayton Connis, has your faith in Kevin Warren wavered at all? Yes, it has. That line was alarmingly stupid about a year is a lifetime. What are you doing, Kevin? Either Ryan Poles is your guy or he isn't. That annoys me. Evan Lepeau, tell me your dream Bears scenario. Don't give me reality. What does Bill want? Bill wants Ben Johnson. Bill wants Ben Johnson and a new general manager that isn't going to be here. I wanted to align GM and head coach this year where you can kind of bring in Ben Johnson with someone he wants to work with, a GM who's excited to work with Ben Johnson, get some synergy and get in the alignment. Yeah, you quarterback first, but they'll be they'll be up for Caleb Williams, right? Number 1 pick in the draft. A lot of promise. No one's, this isn't going to come in. We don't want Caleb Williams, and they're going to blow him out after 2 years like Justin Fields. That wouldn't be the case here. You'd bring in a GM and a head coach. I suggested this idea of Ray Agnew and Ben Johnson. That's my dream scenario. It's not going to happen because Ryan Poles is here. Kurt, are you hearing similar to the Bears blog that Poles is all in on Ben Johnson? I'm not. And again, it's difficult to parse out Poles or Warren. Like, for example, the Bears blog said that he heard that Warren is really enamored with Brian Flores. I have heard that Ryan Poles is really enamored with Brian Flores. Does it matter? What matters is there's someone at Halas Hall that could be pushing for Brian Flores. So that's not a good idea. So I've heard that there's more skepticism from Ryan Poles about Ben Johnson. I don't know if that's 100% to be true. If I felt more confident about it, I'd be tweeting about it, but I'm not putting it out there because, again, I'm not certain, but I don't think there's anything that you can say that's 100% certainty. But if Ben Johnson isn't in Jacksonville and isn't in New England, the Bears choose to go another direction, not Ben Johnson says, I'm going back to Detroit, I don't want to deal with the McCaskies. That's one thing that we'll just have to accept if that happens. But if they choose to go a different direction than Ben Johnson, you better get it right, Bears. You better get it right. Joe Tucio, if Poles likes Ben Johnson, who might be Kevin Warren's favorite? Again, Ben Johnson, Brian Flores, we're hearing this. I think Todd Monken's going to knock his interview out of the park, and I think we see a second interview for Todd Monken. My opinion, I'm not reporting anything. Cav Manning, how is management this blind to doing things? Do you think they slipped up and kind of told us that Poles hasn't been extended? Yeah, I think that is, Kev. I hated that Kevin Warren line. I've talked about it multiple times during this podcast. God, we got a lot of here. Let's see. Got like 10 more. I can't get 10 more in. My God, I've been going 30 minutes. Ty Day, do you think Thomas Brown is being too overlooked because of the dumpster fire he was thrown into? No, because he didn't improve it. That's it. He had a chance he didn't have to do amazing things. He had to at least get it better. It went worse. Things got worse with Thomas Brown. That's it. End of story. It didn't get better. He beat the Packers. Congratulations. You can put that one on the mantle. You can run with that one all day long. It's nice. But the bottom line here is that it got worse with Thomas Brown. I don't think anyone is overlooking him. Right. All right, let's just end it there. I got spammed like 7. All right, that's enough. All right, we'll wrap up the mailbag there. Don't you love how organized I am when I do these podcasts? All right, that'll do it for Bears Banter. We were going to be back as often as we can when there are things to discuss. Could it be next week? Maybe. We'll see how things progress here with the coaching search. Might be the week after that. But I will always try and keep you informed on the Twitter/X timeline. I'll try and get on Blue Sky there more often. I haven't been on it as much the last couple of weeks with the holidays, but I will try and get over there more often for those of you on Blue Sky. Same handle, Blue Sky and Twitter/X. We'll talk to you soon, everybody. Bear down. Adios.